Tut mir leid, keine Sätze, die dich aufmuntern zum Schluss. Auch der letzte Track zieht einen noch runter in den Schmutz.
Das habe ich gesagt.
Charming introduction. So a very warm welcome. Hello, welcome to our panel discussion this late afternoon. My name is Jennifer Sarah Boone, and I'm happy to lead you through this panel discussion at this late-ish hour. I'm sure that you've all already received some input today, quite a bit of input, so that's great. And now I encourage you to mobilize your energy and attention reserves as we are coming to a highly relevant topic for each and every one of us. We leave our data traces every single day in every interaction, but what happens to our data and how can we make sure that our sensitive data is secure? Well, we will be addressing and uncovering the answers to those questions and more in our panel discussion. And I have two fantastic experts who I may address all the questions to. Our first panelist brings vast experience in international internet public policy issues, including privacy, cross-border data flows, and cybersecurity to the table. She knows the perspective of the private sector as well as the government side, and she is very passionate about privacy-preserving data for good. So during COVID, she worked on a project focused on using state-of-the-art privacy-enhancing technologies to leverage mobile phone data to address global challenges like epidemics and climate change. And in case you're wondering what she does when she's not helping us with data for good, well, she loves looking after her dog, and when she can squeeze in the time, then she likes to sew. Today, she squeezed in the time to join me on stage. Please welcome TikTok's Director of Data Public Policy Europe, Jade Nestor. So you can take the yellow seat there. And if you've counted, well, then you can see that we have one more seat, one more free chair. And in case you'd like to know how to respond to cyber-related incidents or what strategy to best follow when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy, well, then our next panelist is the man to ask. He, too, is highly experienced in the public and the private sector, and he advises clients on these issues. He's specialized in the people risk aspects of cybersecurity and is one of the authors of the UK Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure's guidance on managing employee risk. And what may come as a surprise is he reads, writes, and speaks Arabic, and his most memorable meeting was when he met Naguib Mahfouz, the first Egyptian to win a Nobel Prize in Literature, in a coffee shop in Cairo. I'm sure the meeting with me won't be quite as memorable, but I am very happy to welcome the Global Director of Privacy at the NCC Group, Stephen Bailey. You may come in between the ladies. So thank you so much for joining me here on stage. Data and data protection is a hot topic, and it's always tied into regulation. So, Jade, what regulatory trends do you see when it comes to data security and also data government?
I think in general, of course, there's an increased awareness from people about privacy and security, and regular people are asking more questions. And then if we're looking at the high levels, though, government stakeholders, what are they looking at? And that's when we get into these discussions about where data should be located, who has access to data. And one trend we've seen for a long time, I think it's 15, 20 years, this call for data to be stored locally. Some governments saying that data should flow globally, some preferring an approach where it's stored locally. And I think now we're coming to a point where we're thinking, how do we respect privacy, store data locally if we can, but then also have global platforms where people around the world are sharing information with each other. So how do we preserve all of these different interests at the same time? And it's an interesting question at the highest regulatory levels as well.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, what trends do you see? Do you agree with Jade, or are there any other hidden trends emerging that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I do agree with what Jade has said there. I think for organizations, a really hard thing for them to be doing at the moment is there's an increasing pile of laws, regulations, codes, frameworks that have cyber and privacy aspects to them. And so for organization, it's becoming quite hard for them to sort of keep up with what they're doing to protect, not just against the threats outside, those with malicious intent, but also to make sure that they're meeting the requirements for all of these in a way that doesn't overburden them with doing almost the same thing multiple times.
So basically, continuously adapting to the new regulations coming in when you're already a work in progress, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely that. So you get yourself to a nice baseline, and then along comes another one, and following closely behind it is the kind of the codes of conduct and the guidance and all of that kind of thing.
Jade, millions and millions of users and creators trust TikTok with their data. What challenges have you identified regarding these regulatory trends that you are seeing, and more importantly, how are you addressing them?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work to embed the idea of European data sovereignty into just how we manage data and our approach to data governance. And we have a program called Project Clover, which is our European data sovereignty program that has three main components. The first, as we talked about, is data localization. Storing data locally in data centers in Ireland and Norway. This is the Norwegian data center, just to give an idea of what this looks like in practice, because I think a lot of these things come off as quite amorphous, like we're doing this, we're doing that. But this is the actual data center that's being built. So we'll have default storage of European data in Europe by default. That's one part of this. But of course, to build a good data governance and a security program, you need more than that. So we've also enhanced controls around our data and are building digital barriers around European data to oversee data flows in and out of those servers in that data center that you just saw. And then the really novel part of this is actually where Stephen's company comes in, where we've brought in this third-party NCC group to have oversight of the data flows, to bring us to a higher level and a better industry best practice about data governance. This other company is monitoring our data flows and attesting to the security of our system, and that's what we think counts as accountability now.
You said that you are building it and the data will be in Europe. How far are you in the implementation?
So we've already started migrating European user data to the first Irish data center. And then we're building the Norwegian data center, and there's also another data center in Ireland. So the first one I mentioned is already online, and we already started that migration. The goal is the end of the year for that full migration, but in the interim, because as you can imagine, that's quite a big undertaking to move all of that data to those data centers, we have a dedicated separate space, like a cloud storage environment, where we've segregated European data so that we can start building that wall, that digital barrier around data, and then monitoring those data flows of European data. So that has already happened. We call that the European Enclave.
And we just now got to see an image of the data center. It's not exactly small, and
no.
I'm guessing that it probably is a bit of an investment. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And what would interest me specifically is, why would you do that investment? What is your main motivation?
So the investment is about 12 billion euros over a 10-year period. Okay. So it's not insignificant, and that's also reflects other elements of Project Clover as well. So that's one part of it. And why do it? I'm not going to pretend that TikTok's not under a very high level of scrutiny. So we wanted to think about our regulatory foundation, of course, the GDPR, the DSA, responding to that regulatory foundation in Europe. But then what could we do that would go above and beyond that to provide assurances to regulators and to other stakeholders that we're trying to protect user data while having this global experience. And so that's why we made this investment in the local data storage in Europe by default.
So basically you'd say it's a proactive step towards building trust with everyone who uses TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, that's our overall objective, not just to build trust, but to be able to demonstrate trust, to be able to also have someone else be able to say, without us being there, to be able to attest to what we're doing, because I don't think it's enough for us to say, you know, trust us, it's fine. There needs to be this other layer of oversight, and that's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. So Jade already pointed to you when she said that another layer of oversight. So basically you are a independent third party that will be supervising the data. I don't know about the audience. I don't exactly know what that means. Can you explain to us what your work looks like?
Yeah, so our main goal is to make sure that the flow of data and access to the data of users in the UK and the EEA is in line with what TikTok have said they're going to be doing on Project Clover. And we do a range of things as part of that. As Jada says, the user data sits in something called the European Enclave. Above that, or in front of that, there are security gateways, which in effect are digital barriers. And those digital barriers control access to the data, the movement of data, whether it's by a person or by a system that needs to move it around. And we are going right down to the sort of lowest level, so we're reviewing the source code that makes up those gateways. Once we've assured that code, we've also assured the process of that code then going into the live environment. And it's not just a point in time, single point in time. On an ongoing basis, we review any new updates to that code that comes through. Also things like the critical components that support those. We're monitoring the cloud environments in which those digital barriers sit. So we can now see what's going on in there. We can see if there's any changes to those environments, if anything new is added into those environments as well. So that's on the sort of the gateway side of things, so securing it and then monitoring it. We're also doing assessments of a range of things from the main application, so tiktok.com, some of its subdomains, the mobile phone applications for iOS and for Android. And we've done those baselines, and now we're into a cycle of doing monthly reviews as major updates come out. We're also doing a data collection assessment, so we're looking to see what data those applications are actually collecting, where it goes, and what they do with it. On the data center side of things, we're also doing physical assessments of those. So we've been to the one in Ireland twice now, the one in the US, which is the temporary storage. And when the Norway one comes online and the other one in Ireland comes online, we'll be going and doing those. I went to the Norway one to see the big halls before anything was put in, and it was, my overriding memory is it was cold. So it was,
okay.
And then we're doing stuff around data protection, data security. So we're looking at the way that a particular group of bits of user data is approved for a particular bit of processing by a very specific entity. The entity could be a person or a team or a system. They're called data schema, and so we're checking those, and we've validated the flow of those. So from the point they're approved and assured through to when they're deployed, nobody can interfere with them, and when they are deployed, that you can't get in and mess around with them. And then the sort of final one on that is around privacy-enhancing technologies. So TikTok is deploying a number of different privacy-enhancing technologies to give further protection to personal data. So we're involved in looking at how they're going to do that, the balance of sort of utility against security and privacy. We're also taking the output of them, and we're going to attack it to see if we can get into it and unravel it back to the source data.
And why did you choose to have a third party come in and supervise your data?
I think in this case, we wanted to have a best practice level of a program. You know, and I've done some work with other companies actually before TikTok, like Steven, working with companies on cross-border data flows and what data do they have, where, you know, the companies don't necessarily know what data they have, where it's going, and we wanted to bring experts in to help us. I mean, TikTok was already, in my personal experience, a bit better than some of the other companies that I'd worked with in terms of that. But this helped us get to this other level. But then also, again, to bring in third-party oversight to be able to talk independently, for example, to regulators. Like that's huge for us to be able to say, you can talk to NCC Group without us being in the room if you're a data protection authority or a cybersecurity authority. And if they do see something that they think rises to that level where they're alarmed, they can proactively go talk to an authority. And I think for TikTok, because this level of scrutiny that we get, the ultimate complement to the work we're doing internally is to be able to demonstrate that externally through the use of a third party.
Okay. Stephen, if we zoom out of TikTok and have a look at the industry in general, do you see similar initiatives happening other places?
So a lot of the stuff we're doing with TikTok on Project Clover, we do for other organizations, public and private sector. But in my experience, I've never seen it all pulled together in the way it is for Project Clover, and also the level of insight and access that we're given to the key components that form Project Clover.
Yeah, I've been in this space for a long time, and I've never seen any other company give another third party technical access to data flows to monitor them on a continuous basis. I haven't seen that before.
And are you aiming to be a role model then for the rest of the industry?
I think so. I mean, in this European context, I think what we're doing, because it is unprecedented, it hopefully will have that effect, yes.
You talked about the regulations coming up, then the companies needing to match those regulations. Then you have all kinds of different regulations, locally, regionally, but Europe versus the US. Basically, the internet is, you use the internet globally. How can you have the balance between the trend to localize the data, but then for something that is being used all over the world?
Yeah, I think the way that we're trying to do that in practice is to look at all of the different types of data that we have and restrict access to some data more than other data. So we have restricted data, as we call it, which is the data that's more confidential, that's more highly related to an individual, which is not able to be accessed by certain employees, by certain people in the company. So we have that.
Have you got an example for what that kind of data would be?
Yeah, so for example, like an email address or a phone number, you don't have to give us either of those. You have to give one or the other to sign up for TikTok. We don't necessarily have both, but that would be restricted, for example, from access by any employee based in China. They can't access that data. They can't access your real name if you also provided that. These pieces of information that are more relevant to you, about you, they are restricted from access to that if they're based in China. So that's one example of what we're putting in practice. And then all of the data is marked as restricted by default in our system, but then we have 3 different exceptions for that, which we call allowable data, which just have to travel more broadly across our existing data centers, which are in Malaysia and Singapore and the US and Virginia. And that data is things like public data. So if you have a public video that you made, it's listed as public, that needs to flow across the TikTok network. And then also interoperability data. So if you have a private account, your private videos would not be flowing the same way a public video would. It would be restricted. But there's a tag on your account that says this is a private account. That has to get replicated across the different data centers just to preserve that privacy of your account. So things that need to interoperate to make the platform work. And then there's a third type of data where we're applying privacy-enhancing technologies, as Stephen mentioned, to de-identify data to make sure that we can still have some insights from that data, but that there's no personal information that could be revealed from that data set. So that's the other type of allowable data that's subject to a little bit less restriction. Although all of our data access is subject to access controls and role-based access controls, so you can only have that data based on your job, and we review it, and it's all monitored and logged.
Okay. Before we open the panel to our audience, Stephen, what would you say, how does the trend to localization, how will it affect the industry in general, and how companies will be dealing with the data of their users?
So I think organizations are going to, there's sort of two things they'll need to do. One is to be super clear about what data they have and what needs to go where. And then the second thing is to try and find a way of giving it enough protection to allow it to move around without destroying the value in the sharing of that data. And I think one of the trends going forward is going to be around privacy-enhancing technologies. And as they grow, as always happens with the trends, there'll be those with malicious intent who will start to focus in on those data sets to see if they can get into it and unravel it and exploit the underlying data.
Okay, thank you. Then I'd like to hand the panel to the audience. Do we have any questions directly in the audience? We have one there. We have a microphone, right? Yes. Do we? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I have a question on actually the data security requirements that you're setting up, because I felt like when you were explaining the constellation, it was a lot about data security, but also when I looked to the TikTok privacy policy, it was in March the last time I had a look at it. It was quite transparent, so thumbs up for that. That was quite good in that part, because at least back then it also named the recipients. And back then, if I remember right, it was also like a couple of countries outside of the EEA, including Singapore and China. So my question is, when you're looking at your oversight and security requirements, it seemed to me like your threat model was mostly towards criminals or external actors, but you could also have a data request from within the corporation, right? Because you have subsidiaries, you have a mother company. So my question is, how can you ensure that the data is accessed only in a way that would be lawful under GDPR also? Because if there's a access request from, for example, a government that is not holding up to the requirements of rule of law that we have here under the Charter of Fundamental Rights, how would you deal with such a request? Thanks.
I can answer the security bit. So our threat modeling looked at inside and outside actors. We didn't limit that. The gateways we've described, they are set up in a way that looks at when a person comes to access the personal data in the European enclave, it goes through a number of checks to make sure that what they're trying to do, they're allowed to do. I can't go into the specifics of those, obviously, but we are looking for things like where are they coming from? Is this a known person within the system? Is where they're trying to get to somewhere that would be expected for that person, for the area of the business they work in? and a whole range of other things as well.
So, yeah, so I think, it's a good question. So, and as you mentioned, we do the threat modeling of the government access, and the entire system is also designed to create friction to prevent that exact scenario that you're asking about. If we get a legitimate request from a government where TikTok operates, because to clarify, of course, TikTok itself doesn't operate in China. So if we're getting one from, let's just say, Brazilian police because something happened and they're asking about it, that gets filtered through our trust and safety teams, law enforcement team in Dublin. So they're based in Dublin. So that team monitors it, and then we report on that in our transparency reporting. For the other scenario that you're talking about, there's 3 different layers of friction built into this. So there's the legal setup of the company. So the joint controllership for European data is our Irish entity and our UK entity. And so they are the custodians of that data, well, technically that data enclave now, but then also in this future state, all of that data that's in Ireland and Norway, they are making decisions, legal decisions about whether that data could be compelled. And they cannot be compelled, for example, by the Chinese government to provide data from that European data center. So that's one setup. The other element is that security barrier that Stephen is talking about. So let's just say someone hypothetically said, go get data about someone, and that data is about an IP address or something, hypothetically like that. Because that data is in this restricted environment, the technical system will not let them get that data. So there's a technical block that stops someone from one of these unauthorized countries from getting it. And the privacy policy, as you mentioned, does have a number of different countries in it. And that's like the full picture of where data could be accessed under a GDPR definition of personal data. But the restricted data that I mentioned can't be accessed by those employees in China. So there is that technical barrier. And that's why NCC Group is also monitoring any source code updates for that digital barrier, so that there's another technical level to prevent that kind of access that you're talking about that would be more of an attack, really, at that point, if someone was trying to get it that way. So that's how we do it. And then there are certain types of data sets which would be available to employees in China in this setup, but none of them are available on an identifiable basis. So we're using privacy-enhancing technologies to make it so that there's no identifier that is linked to any of the data that they could hypothetically access. And that's one of the conditions of this setup. So I know it's a bit confusing, but it's basically like, where are those access points? How could they ask for it? And how do you stop it at each level?
Okay, thank you. We have one more question. Where's the... great, thank you.
So, China doesn't have personal data, but it's possible to analyze the collective data of the Europeans. Did I understand that correctly?
By collective, I mean, there's one data set that it would be completely aggregated or subject to differential privacy depending on the type of data that it is. And that's like business insight data. So it's not, it's subject to a very robust process where we have a number of academics, both the ones working with NCC, but then also other academics trying to reverse engineer that to make sure that there's no personal data that can be identified in the data. I think if you're looking more broadly, anyone can access TikTok who has TikTok.com, right? Anywhere around the world. So we are trying to do what we can in what we can control in terms of our own data governance. In terms of what outside actors might try to do with TikTok data, we have teams that are focused on that internally as well, but that turns into more of like a threat modeling for outside attackers. And we actually have a dedicated report that we are going to start putting out, which is just focused on campaigns like inauthentic behavior, for example.
Okay, I already got the sign that we have to close the panel, unfortunately. Before we close, I would like to ask both of you to quickly give us an overview of what you think the future trends will be. And let's say the audience was tired, couldn't pay attention to everything. What would be the one takeaway you want them to go home with? Jade, you're going to go first.
the life that we have today cannot persist with a fractured internet, full stop. So you have to figure out how to have interoperability of data. And I know some people will say like, oh, but that's different than the China issue. But it's not. It could be any country. It could be India. It could be any other country. It could be Gulf states. Are you really not going to have any data that's transferring between those jurisdictions? But so there has to be technology, like those privacy-enhancing technologies that we talked about, where you can share information without sharing any information about a person that could create risks for them. And I think that's the future. How do you continue to live how we live today in a way that doesn't expose people to more privacy risks?
Okay, thank you. Stephen.
For trends, I would say AI, because it's kind of the hot topic. On the defensive side, it's going to help organizations to be able to deal much better with the kind of velocity, variety of attacks that go on. And on the attack side, it's allowing people with malicious intent to have a lower barrier to entry. So we're going to see a spread of that. The main takeaway thing I would say is that at NCC Group, our aim is to make the online world safer and more secure. And I really do think that the work that we're doing as part of Project Clover is helping to achieve that here in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. I would say it's pretty clear that we just scratched the topic, that we could talk here for quite a while more. So I do encourage you to continue the conversation beyond the stage. I think I can also speak for Jade and for Stephen when I say, please reach out to us, connect with us if you want to learn more about this topic, because it concerns all of us. Thank you for your questions. Have a fantastic remaining evening. Thank you and bye-bye. Thank you to the two of you.